Chapter 1. Matthew Carlton, you're not leaving this table until you finish those peas, Mrs. Carlton said firmly. But, Mom, I've got to finish packing, Matt pleaded. It's our first official club camp out tonight, and since I'm president of the club, I've got to make sure that we have everything we need. What's this about a club and a camp out? Mr. Carlton asked, putting a fork full of noodles on in his mouth. Matt and some of the boys in the neighborhood have started a club and they want to sleep out tonight, Mrs. Carlton told him. It's not just a goofy club, Dad, like stamp collectors or something. It's an adventure club. Tony, Hooter, Q, and I are all members. We meet and talk about real adventures that people have had throughout history. Q gave the club this old set of books that his uncle had given him called Great Adventures in History. At every meeting, we're going to read about one adventure. The first one that we picked out is the crossing of the Delaware by George Washington and his army during the Revolutionary War. Q and I did our history report on George Washington, so we know a lot of stuff already that we can tell the other members. We're going to camp out tonight in Tony's yard. It was my idea to start the club in the first place, so I'm the president. I've got a lot of things to check on, so can I please be excused? Matt began to stand up. Hold on, champ, his father chuckled. Your club sounds fine, but you got peas on your plate, and your mother wants you to finish. Just think of them as an adventure in eating. Go on now and finish them up. Matt groaned. I'd rather face a bloodthirsty vampire or a wild cat or a... Soon he was lost in thought while imagining all the things he'd rather face than the pile of disgusting green things on his plate. The phone suddenly rang in the kitchen, bringing him back to the reality of the dinner table. He watched as Mr. Carlton got up and answered it. Then Matt stole a glance at his little sister, Katy, who was sitting across from him playing with the noodles on her plate. With one hand, she poked her fork in and out of the noodles, and with her other hand, she twisted one of her bright red curls around her finger. Katy Carlton, how many times do I have to tell you to stop twisting that hair? Mrs. Carlton sighed as she got up and went to the refrigerator. Timing, Matt was thinking. It's all a matter of timing. Quickly, he reached over and took the lid off the sugar bowl, then dropped in all the peas from his dish. He placed the lid back on a second before his mother returned to the table. Then he glanced back at Katy, whose mouth had dropped open as she stared at the sugar bowl. Oh, great, Matt moaned to himself, giving her a hard, cold stare, but Katy had begun to giggle. Mr. Carlton got off the phone and returned to the table. He picked up his glass of iced tea. Honey, did you want more sugar for that? Mrs. Carlton asked, passing the sugar bowl to her husband. Mr. Carlton took the sugar bowl and placed it beside his plate. No, I think I'm fine, he said. Katy was unable to suppress herself, and before too long was doubled over in her seat, giggling. And just what is all that about, Catherine? Mrs. Carlton asked, looking over to Katy. Nothing, Mom, Matt assured her. You know how silly she gets when she starts to play with her food. She was just making the noodles wiggle on her plate like worms, weren't you, Katy? Matt pinched her arm from under the table. Ow, Katy said, lifting her arm and pointing to the sugar bowl. How would you like to come camping with our club tonight, Katy? Matt blurted out. He was desperate. He couldn't risk his parents handing out any punishment tonight. He could just imagine having to explain to the guys that their president couldn't make the first venture of their club because his parents were punishing him for filling the sugar bowl with peas. Katy quickly put down her arm and beamed with delight. Oh boy, I'm going camping with Matt. That's good of you to include your sister, Mr. Carlton smiled at Matt. Yes, it's very nice of you, Mrs. Carlton smiled. In fact, everyone except Matt. Great, he thought to himself. My first adventure with the club, and I had to drag along a girl, a 7-year-old baby girl. He glared at Katy, who grinned back, giving one of her curls a twist. Chapter 2. Can we go home and get my blanket? Katie's voice came from inside the tent. The first meeting of the Venture Club had just come to order. President Matthew Carlton had taken attendance, collected dues, 25 cents or equal amounts of candy, and had ordered Katy to wait in the tent. Matt shook his head in disgust as he sat at the campfire with the other club members, Tony, Q, and Hooter. Go to sleep, Katy. We can't get your blanket now. It's too late. He called over the crackling of the campfire. Q handed Matt a thick green book. The words Adventures in History, Volume 4, were printed in large gold letters on the cover. Matt looked over to Tony and Hooter. You and I did our history report together on George Washington, he told them. So if you have any questions, we can probably answer them since we did so much research. You only read one library book for that report, Tony objected. You can't call one book so much research. You didn't see the size of that book, Tony, Matt told him. It was big. I mean, really big. Look, Tony, we're not saying that we know everything about the Revolutionary War, but we did do a report on it, and we do know what more than you do, Q said smugly. Okay, guys, let's not waste any more time trying to decide who knows more about the Revolutionary War. Q got his book from his uncle, and none of us have read it yet, so be quiet and listen. Matt opened the book to the page that had a bookmark on it. In it, the crossing of the Delaware River in the War for Independence, he began. Between the autumn of 1775 and the autumn of 1776, the rebel army had suffered such great losses that many feared the American cause was soon to be lost. I thought we won the war, Hooter interrupted. It sounds like we lost it. We almost did lose it, Matt told him, looking up from the book. That's why this adventure is so incredible. Listen. Matt looked back down to the book and continued reading. As he made his way across New Jersey, General Washington was in desperate need of food and supplies for his ill clad army. New Jersey was at this time a state divided in its loyalties. Many farmers felt that they should owe their allegiance to King George and would not accept the new Confederate money that the Congress had issued to the army. British spies were everywhere. The rebels themselves were ill trained and inexperienced soldiers, most of them having more experience with the plow than the bayonet. If these were not enough obstacles for General Washington, the winter of 1776 proved to be the harshest weather that the region had ever experienced. But as discouraged as Washington was, he was not prepared to accept defeat, not yet. The American army was on the verge of collapse and in desperate need of a victory in order to turn the tide in their favor. The crossing of the Delaware and the taking of Trenton on December 26th proved to be such a victory. Can you imagine what it must have been like? Matt said suddenly, looking up from the book. Cold, Q replied. Really, really cold. They crossed the river at night in the middle of rain and ice and snow. They must have been freezing. Just like we're going to be if we let this fire go out, Tony said as he got up to get another log for the fire. Matt put down the book and joined the other club members in carrying over a load of wood from the woodpile in the camp to the campsite. Tony's dad had helped them to build the fire after they had set up the tent behind the garage. He had given them a long lecture on fire safety before he finally left them alone and went back into the house. Matt thought camping in Tony's yard was okay, but he wished it were a little more wild and dangerous. If Tony's father had let them make a camp along the lake like they had wanted to, it would have been perfect. As it was, Tony's parents kept coming to the kitchen door and peeking out to check on them every 10 minutes. Sometimes they treat me like I was in second grade or something, Tony groaned, waving his mother away from the door. It's probably because you're so small, Q pointed out. Yeah, Tony, I've seen some second graders that are a whole lot bigger than you, Hooter added. Tony shrugged his shoulders. He was used to people pointing out his height or lack of it. He was the shortest boy in the fifth grade. It's just because of his size that Tony is such an important member of the club, Matt said with authority, sitting back down in front of the fire. It is? Tony squeaked, sitting beside him. Sure, since you're the smallest man, you'll be our scout. You can do all the tracking, traveling ahead of us to check out things without being seen. And since you're so small, you weigh less than any of us. Do you remember those Indian scouts in the Davy Crockett book we read? Remember how they could walk through the woods without making a sound? Well, you don't think they weighed 300 pounds, do you? No, I guess not, Tony grinned, throwing his shoulders back and sitting up straight like an Indian scout. Matt turned to Q. Q's name was Quentin, but everyone called him Q for short. Now, Q, you'll be the club's brain, Matt told him. Everyone here knows that you have the fastest brain in the fifth grade, maybe even the whole school, except for Carla Ponte, Tony interrupted. Have you seen what Carla Ponte looks like lately? Hooter said with a grin. She had her hair permed or something, and it looks like a Brillo pad that's been microwaved. Not too smart, but then she's a girl. What do you expect? Matt shook his head. Now, Q, we're going to need some quick thinking if we get in some or die situation, so be prepared to think. I know, Q said, taking off his glasses to wipe the mosquito from them. I already thought of that, and I have no intention of perming my hair. So what about me? Hooter interrupted. What's my job? Hooter's real name was Brian Melrose, but he didn't look anything at all like a Brian Melrose. To Matt, he had always looked like a young version of Fred Flintstone. He was big and kind of goofy looking, but he was a softy at heart. In the third grade, he had found a baby oil owl with a broken wing. He put it in a little box and carried it with him wherever he went, hooting softly to it all the while. His parents finally made him take the owl to the animal shelter, but by then he had done so much hooting that all the kids in the neighborhood had started calling him Hooter, and the name just stuck. Don't worry, Hooter. I've got a big job for you, Matt assured him. You'll be our strong man. Whenever we find ourselves in a situation that takes abnormal strength and more muscle than we can muster, we'll turn to you. And if we come across any baby animals, that will be your department. What do you think? Can you handle it? Piece of cake, Chief. Hooter grinned, flexing his muscles. Then he suddenly stopped and looked toward the tent. Matt and the rest of the boys followed Hooter's gaze. Everyone was quiet, listening to the little voice coming from the tent. What's my job, Chief? Everyone looked at Matt and grinned, but Matt frowned instead. Forget it, Katie, he scowled. No girls are allowed in the adventure club, he said firmly. Little voice answered, I'm not a girl, I'm a sister. No, Katie, what you are is a pain. Now be quiet and go to sleep. The only reply from the tent was some loud sniffling. Oh, Matt, have a heart. Hooter stood up and walked toward the tent. Why can't we make her a visiting member just for tonight? Technically speaking, the club's charter dictates that no females are allowed in the club, visiting or otherwise, Q told him. Okay, but it's like Katie said, she's not just a girl, she's a relative. That should count for something, Hooter pointed out. None of you guys have a little sister, and believe me, you don't know what pains they can be, Matt tried to explain. I sort of know how she feels, Tony said. It's not much fun always being the littlest and the one that always gets left out. Come on, Matt, just for tonight. She can't be that bad, Hooter laughed, opening the tent. Okay, Matt sighed, but don't say I didn't warn you. As Hooter held open the tent flap, the newest temporary member of the adventure club stumbled out in the light of the campfire. Her head was a blaze of red curls. Over her shoulder was a toy bow with the arrows in a pouch on her back. She held a water gun in one hand and a plastic heroic hero sword in the other. She took a step toward the group and shot Hooter in the nose with her squirt gun. I'm ready for the venture, Chief, she said with a dimpled grin.